They told me I was aiming too high, that I didn't fit the mold, that med school was for people with different backgrounds, cleaner transcripts, perfect scores, the right connections, and most of all, the right kind of face, the right zip code, the right pedigree. But what they didn't know was that telling me I couldn't was the same as daring me to, and I've never been one to back down from a challenge, especially not when it comes wrapped in condescension and tied with the ribbon of low expectations. So when my high school guidance counselor leaned across her desk, eyebrows arched in mock sympathy, voice laced with a performative kind of care that felt more like a slap than support, and said, "Sweetheart, people like you don't go to med school," something inside me didn't break. It caught fire, and that fire lit the next decade of my life with a kind of white-hot resolve I didn't even know I had until that moment. A moment I replayed every time I wanted to quit, every time I was told again and again, "You're not ready, you don't belong here, you should consider something more realistic," which is a word people love to weaponize against anyone trying to rise above the limits placed on them by circumstances they didn't choose. And while they were busy pointing out everything that was missing from my so-called profile, no legacy, no Ivy League summer programs, no polished family name, no shadowing hours under a relative's prestigious title, I was busy stacking hours. At 2 jobs, acing community college night classes, studying human anatomy from a secondhand textbook on my bus rides across town, filling notebooks with color-coded notes like my life depended on it, because in a way it did, and I wasn't studying to impress anyone, I was studying to survive, to rise, to prove, not to them but to me, that I had what it took, even if the system said otherwise, even if the stats said my chances were a fraction of a percent, even if every application cycle felt like climbing a cliff with bare hands, because what they never seem to understand is that kids like me don't need perfect conditions to bloom. We bloom through concrete, through broken systems, through slashed funding and silent expectations of failure, and it was in those silent moments, late at night, dead tired, with rejection letters pinned on my wall like darts in a target, that I told myself over and over, "You're not done." And then came the MCAT, the monster of a test that reduces dreams into data points, and I studied for that test like it was my last breath. 8 months straight of flashcards, practice tests, caffeine-fueled marathons of memorization, teaching myself biochemistry on a cracked laptop, watching Khan Academy videos at 2 a.m. while my roommates partied, and when I finally took that test and the screen went black after the last question, I walked out of that room feeling nothing, not because I didn't care but because I had poured every drop of energy into that moment, and the waiting nearly broke me. But when the score came back and it was just high enough to scrape the bottom end of the average for my top choice school, I screamed into my pillow like I had just won a war, because in many ways I had, but the MCAT was just the gate, and I still had to get through the door, still had to convince admissions committees that I wasn't a risk but an investment, even though I knew some of them would look at my file and see every gap, every flaw, every reminder that I didn't come from the world they were used to. But I didn't care, because I wasn't asking for permission. I was showing up with receipts, with stories, with scars, with passion that couldn't be faked. And when I walked into my first interview wearing the only suit I owned, borrowed from a cousin and a size too big, I held my head up like it was tailored, answered every question with the full force of my journey, and when they asked why I wanted to be a doctor, I didn't give them some rehearsed line about helping people or loving science. I told them the truth, that I knew what it was like to be dismissed, to be underserved, to be misdiagnosed, and I wanted to be the kind of doctor who listened, who saw the patient behind the chart, who didn't flinch at pain or poverty or complexity. And when that first acceptance letter came, I didn't cry. I laughed loud and long, like the joke had finally come full circle, like I could hear that counselor's voice in my head, and I wanted to say, "Hey, guess what?" But med school wasn't the finish line, it was just the first mile, and no one tells you how brutal it is, how isolating, how imposter syndrome follows you like a shadow even when you're getting the grades, how the competition never stops and the sleepless nights become normal and you start to question your sanity and your stamina and your soul. But every time I felt like I couldn't keep up, I remembered why I started, remembered that this wasn't just about me. It was about every kid told they weren't enough, every single person who looked in the mirror and saw potential but got handed pity instead of power, and the nights on call, the blood, the bone-deep exhaustion, the way I had to sit with grief, with failure, with mistakes that cost more than points on a test. All of it sharpened me, broke me, built me, until I stood in the OR for the first time as a resident, hands gloved, heart pounding, staring down at a human life on the table and realizing, this is it, this is the moment. And I was here, I was really here, no longer trying to prove I belong but knowing that I did. And just when I thought I had faced all the doubts the world could throw at me, I heard her voice again, Not in my head this time, but real, echoing across years and circumstance, because guess who showed up in my scared, older, with that same tight-lipped smile and those eyes that once looked at me like I was a lost cause, and now? Now she was the patient and I was the surgeon holding the scalpel. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths. I recognized her before I saw the chart, before I read her name, before anyone spoke a word, because there are some voices you never forget, and hers was one of them, the one that first tried to cap my future with her assumptions, shrink my ambition into something small and manageable and acceptable, and now here she was on my table, fragile and anxious in the way patients always are when they're facing the unknown. Except I knew this wasn't just about a tumor or a procedure, this was about the weight of a full-circle moment landing with surgical precision, and part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to gloat, but all of me, the trained, disciplined, bound by oath professional I had become, stayed steady because I wasn't here for revenge, I was here to save her, to do the job she once told me I'd never have, and as I stood there, masked and gowned, listening to the attending walk us through the plan, I felt something strange, not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that only comes when you realize your life has been leading to this exact intersection, where the past and present meet under fluorescent lights, and the stakes are literal life and death, because I wasn't some kid in her office anymore, I was the one she had to trust now, and the irony wasn't lost on me, how the same hands she once waved off as unqualified were now about to hold her life, steady and deliberate, and I wondered, just for a second, if she would recognize me, if she'd see behind the mask and remember the teenager with fire in their eyes and a rejection letter in their hand, or if I was just another anonymous pair of gloves in the oar. But before I could get lost in that thought, we were already moving, already cutting, already inside, and every minute demanded full focus, because this wasn't about poetry or justice or revenge. This was about precision and care and decisions that couldn't afford distraction, and I fell into the rhythm like I always did, hands working with muscle memory and mind like a blade, steady through each layer, each landmark, until finally the tumor came into view, a stubborn little mass wedged too close to a vital artery, the kind of thing that turns routine into risk, and I heard the attending's voice shift, saw the way the nurse's eyes darted to the monitor, and I knew, we were walking a razor's edge now, and failure was not an option, not today, not with her on the table, not with everything this moment represented, and the weirdest thing happened. I felt calm, clearer than I'd ever been, like every hard-earned hour of struggle had prepared me for this, and I stepped in, took the lead without hesitation because they trusted me to, because I'd earned that trust over sleepless years and blood-soaked scrubs, and my hands moved with purpose, each movement deliberate, each cut respectful, careful, and when the mass finally separated clean from the artery and the bleeding slowed and the team exhaled as one, I didn't smile. Didn't gloat, I just nodded because it was done, she was safe and I had done my job. But when she woke up in post-op and I walked into her room with my chart and my coat and my calm, professional tone, she blinked at me once, twice, and then her eyes widened and I saw it. The recognition, the flash of memory cutting through the morphine fog, and she whispered my name like it was a question, like she couldn't believe it, like the universe had played a trick on her and was now waiting for the punchline, and I just said, "Yes, it's me," and waited because I didn't know what she'd say, didn't know if she'd apologize or deny or pretend, but what she did say stopped me cold because it wasn't what I expected at all. Instead she said, "I knew you'd come back," and I felt the floor shift beneath me because that wasn't guilt, that was something else, and before I could ask what she meant, her daughter walked in, pale and breathless, eyes darting between us like she'd walked in on something explosive, and she said, "Doctor, we need to talk, it's about my mother, there's something you don't know." And I looked at the woman in the bed who was suddenly silent, eyes closed now like she didn't want me to hear what was coming, and I turned back to the daughter, who looked at me with something between fear and urgency and said, "She didn't tell you the whole truth about why she said those things to you back then?" And just like that, the narrative I'd carried for a decade started to crack, because maybe this wasn't just a story about judgment and underestimation, maybe there was a shadow behind her words I had never seen, and I was about to find out what it was. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths. I stared at the daughter, trying to decide if what I felt in that moment was disbelief, suspicion, or something else entirely, because her face wasn't just urgent, it was haunted, like she'd been waiting for years to say something, and now that the chance was here, the words were tearing themselves out of her, and behind her, the woman in the bed, my former counselor, my first gatekeeper, my accidental nemesis, lay still, eyes shut tight as if bracing for impact, as if she knew that once the truth left the room there'd be no stuffing it back in, and I said quietly, "What truth?" not trusting myself to speak any louder, and the daughter stepped forward and glanced at her mother before saying, "She didn't mean to hurt you back then, but she had to push you away," and the way she said it, with that odd emphasis, didn't feel like pity or guilt, it felt like revelation. And in that instant I knew that whatever came next was going to rewrite the story I had lived with for over a decade. And, she continued, she recognized something in you and it scared her, not because she thought you weren't good enough but because she knew you were exactly like someone she lost. And now the room was spinning, not physically but in the way a truth can rearrange everything you've built your identity around, and she reached into her purse and pulled out a faded photo, soft around the edges, and when I looked at it, my breath caught because I saw myself, not literally but someone who looked eerily like me, maybe a few years older, standing in a white coat, grinning wide in front of a hospital backdrop, and the daughter said, "That's my brother. He was supposed to be the first doctor in our family, full scholarship, brilliant, driven, didn't sleep, didn't stop, didn't listen when he should have, and in his third year of med school he collapsed on a rotation. He had an undiagnosed heart condition no one saw coming." And her voice cracked a little, but she didn't stop. "My mom never got over it. She blamed herself for not telling him to slow down, for encouraging him too much, and when she saw you she saw him, same drive, same background, same fire, and it terrified her, so she tried to put out the fire before it burned you alive too." And I felt my knees weaken because in one moment she had taken a scalpel to the narrative I'd carried like a scar and shown me the nerve beneath it, raw and complex. Not malice but misplaced protection, and I looked at the woman in the bed, so small now, so human, and felt everything I didn't expect. Not rage, not righteousness, but sorrow, the kind that comes from realizing someone's cruelty was never about you at all, and I didn't know what to say, because what do you say when the villain in your story turns out to be a ghost trying to rewrite their own grief? But the daughter wasn't done. She leaned in and said, "There's something else," and I braced myself, because if the floor had already shifted once, it could collapse completely now, and she said, "There's a file. My mom kept it all these years in a locked drawer at home. I only found it last week after her pre-op scans came in and I flew in to help," and she reached into her bag again, pulled out a small manila envelope, and handed it to me like it was some ancient artifact, something holy and dangerous all at once. And when I opened it, my heart jumped, because inside were copies of my transcripts, my early college essays, my MCAT prep schedule, letters she must have intercepted or requested somehow, tracking me, following my journey, even after she told me to give up. And on one of the pages in her handwriting was a note. "He's going to do it. I was wrong to try to stop him. But maybe." I helped light the fire, and that was when I understood. She hadn't just been watching me all these years, she'd been rooting for me in secret, carrying the guilt like a second skin, unable to say the words but needing to witness what she couldn't allow herself to encourage. And I stood there, thunderstruck, everything I thought I knew about who I was and what fueled me spinning in reverse, and before I could even speak, alarms sounded, her heart monitor spiked, her breathing grew shallow, and within seconds the room was chaos, nurses rushing in, calling for the attending, pushing the daughter gently aside, and I slipped back into role, grabbing gloves, checking vitals, barking orders, because no matter what she'd said or done, she was my patient now, and I wasn't about to lose her. Not now, not like this, not with the truth finally on the table, but just as I reached to stabilize her I felt a tug on my coat and looked down, and she was awake, barely, eyes locked on mine, lips trembling like they were trying to shape a final sentence. And then she whispered one word, just one, barely audible but clear enough to freeze my spine, "Folder." And before I could ask what she meant, her body convulsed, machines screamed louder, and they were pulling me away, out of the room, hands everywhere, and the last thing I saw as the doors swung closed was the daughter, sobbing, reaching into her mother's bag again with shaking hands, because apparently that envelope wasn't the only one. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths. The doors slammed shut behind me and I stood there frozen, back against the wall, heart still racing from the adrenaline of the code, the weight of that one word, folder, echoing louder than the alarms ever could, because it wasn't just a word, it was a key, a breadcrumb, a buried fuse waiting to be lit, and I didn't know yet whether it would blow open closure or unleash something I wasn't ready for. And all I could think as I peeled off my gloves and scrub cap was, what else did she keep? Because that envelope already shattered the story I'd been telling myself for years, and now there was more, and whatever folder she meant, whatever was still hidden, felt like the final piece of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been solving all along, so I went back to the waiting area and found her daughter sitting there, pale and shaken, the manila envelope crumpled beside her, and I crouched in front of her and said quietly, "What folder was she talking about?" And she looked up at me like she was deciding whether to protect a secret or finally let it breathe, and then she reached into her bag, deeper this time, into a zipped inner pocket, and pulled out a second folder, larger, thicker, older, the kind of folder that looks like it's held back time, and she handed it to me with both hands like it was something fragile and nuclear, and I took it slowly, sat down, and opened it. What I found inside made my blood run cold. There were old newspaper clippings, medical school acceptance letters that weren't mine, records from a different name, one I didn't recognize at first, and then it hit me. They weren't hers, they were mine, except they weren't, not exactly, they belonged to someone connected to me, someone I had only heard about in whispers from my grandmother, someone my own family barely spoke of because of the pain, my father's older brother, my uncle, a man who disappeared from family stories, erased after what they called a tragedy, and now here he was, alive in paper form, glowing in photographs with stethoscopes around his neck, lab coats and whiteboards and surgical gloves. He'd made it too. Once he'd gotten in, he'd gotten far, and then one day, gone, and the daughter was watching me now, reading my face, and she said softly, "He was her student too," and I looked up, stunned, and she continued, "Your uncle. Years ago. She mentored him through undergrad, said he was the most promising student she'd ever had, and when he got into med school she threw a party in the counseling office, banners, cake, the whole thing, but then he disappeared, dropped out his second year. No one knew why. She never told anyone what happened, not until you showed up and reminded her so much of him, and my heart was pounding again because the story was shifting again, bending in ways I couldn't follow, and I said, "Why didn't she ever tell me?" And the daughter said, "Because she promised your family she wouldn't," and now the edges of reality were curling, because I was staring at a folder full of someone else's dreams and failures and trauma that had been hidden from me my whole life, and somehow this woman, this counselor, had held on to them, carried them, watched me rise with that buried history pressing against every word she said, and I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that I'd been chasing ghosts this whole time, or that she'd been haunted by one too. But before I could say anything else, a nurse rushed in and called my name, her voice urgent, low, not panicked but serious, and she said, "We need you to come." Now, it's her, and I ran, folder in hand, heart thudding, because everything in me said this is it, the moment, the reckoning, the answer. But when I got to her room it was empty. Not clinically empty, vacant. No machines, no monitors, no patient. Bed stripped, for pole gone, curtains wide open like no one had been there at all. I turned to the nurse, breath caught in my throat, and asked, "Where is she?" And the nurse looked just as confused and said, "She was here 10 minutes ago." Then a man showed up with credentials, transferred her out. Said she was being taken to a private facility. "But who?" I asked. "What man?" And the nurse frowned and said, "He didn't give his name. He just left this," and handed me a small sealed envelope. My name was handwritten across the front. In her writing. Inside, a single note. No greeting. No goodbye. Just this. "Ask your father what really happened. He's the only one who knows. And he was never supposed to tell you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths." I stared at the note, my hands trembling, that single sentence echoing through me like a siren in an empty canyon. "Ask your father what really happened. He's the only one who knows. And he was never supposed to tell you." And just like that, everything shifted again, because what I thought was about me and her, about ambition and underestimation, about grit versus gatekeeping, had always been about something bigger, something older, rooted in blood and silence and choices made long before I ever walked into that counselor's office. And now I was holding a thread that ran through decades, and I could either pull it or let it lie, but you already know what I did, because I didn't survive everything I did just to stop when the truth was within reach, so I drove straight to my father's house, no warning, no time to rehearse the questions, because some truths only come out if you hit them fast and raw. And when I walked through his door with that envelope in hand and the counselor's note folded in my back pocket like a loaded weapon, I didn't even sit down, I just looked him in the eye and said, "Tell me about your brother. Tell me what happened. Tell me why you never said a word." And the look on his face, shock, then sorrow, then something like surrender, told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. But then he did, and what came out was a story that shattered me more than any rejection letter, more than any judgment I'd ever carried, because it wasn't just that my uncle had dropped out of med school. He had been forced out, blacklisted after filing a complaint against a tenured professor who had been verbally abusive to students from non-traditional backgrounds, the kind of man who thrived on fear and humiliation and was protected by the institution because he published well and raised grant money, and my uncle, brilliant, stubborn, too principled for his own survival, refused to stay quiet, and in return the system closed around him like a vice, one rotation after another revoked, letters of recommendation pulled, evaluations suddenly turning hostile, until he was too burned out to keep going, too humiliated to explain, and one night he came home and told my grandparents he was leaving the program just like that, and a few months later he disappeared. No one knew if he left the country, started over under another name, or something worse, and my father, barely out of high school at the time, promised the family he'd never speak of it again, especially not to me, because my mother didn't want that shadow over my dreams, didn't want me growing up with fear stitched into my ambition. And when I asked him if he ever wondered where his brother went, he just nodded and said, "Every day," and then more quietly, "But you became what he never could." And part of me always knew, maybe you were meant to finish what he started, and that was it. That was the moment I realized this whole journey, from the counselor's cold words to the first time I scrubbed in, had never been just about proving them wrong or proving myself right. It was about breaking a cycle, about standing where someone else once fell and saying, "Not this time." And as I sat there with my father in that quiet living room, surrounded by photos that had never included my uncle, I made a decision, one that had been building in me for years but only now crystallized. I wasn't just going to be a surgeon. I was going to build something. A mentorship initiative. A scholarship fund in my uncle's name. A safe pipeline for students from backgrounds like mine, like his, like countless others who never made it because no one thought they should. And the next morning when I opened my laptop and typed out the mission statement, I felt something lift. Something I didn't even know I was carrying, and I emailed the counselor's daughter a copy of the name, the Elias program, after the uncle I never met, and under it, a dedication, for those who were told they couldn't, and those who never got to prove they could. And then, a week later, I got a letter, handwritten, from a private care facility in upstate New York. The return address? No name. Inside. Just a single line. "You've done more than prove me wrong. You've proven why I was wrong. And that's something I'll never stop being grateful for." No signature. But I knew who it was from. This isn't just a story about proving people wrong. It's about transforming the pain of being underestimated into purpose. Sometimes the people who try to hold you back are projecting their own fears, failures, and grief. And sometimes, what looks like rejection is actually the ripple effect of a much deeper wound. But your journey is not defined by who doubts you, it's shaped by what you do in the face of that doubt. Let every no sharpen your vision. Let every closed door teach you how to build your own. Because when you rise, you don't just climb for yourself. You carry the name of everyone who couldn't. And in doing so, you become more than what they thought possible. You become the proof. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths.